As the offseason marches on, the Seattle Kraken have a few things that they need to check off of their to-do list. And top of the list is a Matty Beniers extension. What else is on the list? Plus, how are the Firebirds getting ready for the Calder Cup Final? All that and more coming up on today's episode of Locked On Kraken.
You are Locked On Kraken, your daily podcast on the Seattle Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what do you say, Seattle hockey fans? Welcome to another episode of Locked On Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we bring you your favorite team every single day. My name is Erica Ayala. I'm your host of Locked On Kraken. Been with you since before the expansion draft and excited for another offseason. The offseason is really my favorite time. There's just so many storylines. We've got the draft coming up. We still have AHL playoffs coming up. We'll get into that. And of course, free agency. Before, though, we get into some of the nit and the grit of what that looks like for the Seattle Kraken, I want to let you know that today's episode brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers of FanDuel will get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. I gave you some Seattle Storm odds the other day. They're still in the top 4 to finish at the top of the WNBA. I think they still have a little bit of work to do, but you can check out future bets. We talk about future bets a lot, especially with Matty Beniers in his Rookie of the Year campaign. You can find all of that on FanDuel, so go check it out. But I want to talk about Matty Beniers. I think a lot of people were disappointed with his season last year, coming off, as I just mentioned, Rookie of the Year, and he was down about 9 goals from his performance in his Rookie of the Year season. And so what is that going to look like now, knowing that the Seattle Kraken, and Ron Francis has talked about this for the better half of the last year and a half, that they have to keep some cap space to be able to extend Matty Beniers. And we understand that those conversations are happening right now. Glenn Dreyfus, who, of course, is the reporter for the Hockey News, put together a few little nuggets from a few different reports. And so here's what we know. Matty Beniers, his contract, his entry-level contract, will expire July 1, which, of course, is when free agency opens up. He will be a restricted free agent for the Seattle Kraken. Now, in his Calder Trophy winning season, he had 57 points overall, 24 goals. That dipped to 37 points overall, 15 goals last year. Now, I know a lot of people, and we talked about it on this podcast, talking about, he was focused on the face-off too much. What do I say all the time, everydayers and OGers? If you're going to be a top 6 centerman and you can't win faceoffs, then guess what? In my estimation, you're probably not a top 6 centerman. So did I like that his, offense dipped? Of course not. He wasn't the only one. If his offense dipped, but his defense improved, am I willing to take that? Absolutely. One, because of what I just said, you can't be a top 6 centerman if you can't win faceoffs, in my estimation. But number 2, and I have been saying this throughout last season, what I liked about Matty Beniers is that even if the goals weren't coming, he was finding other ways to impact the game. And heaven knows the Seattle Kraken need to be better at the face-off dot. So what does this mean for a contract extension? Well, Glenn and a lot of other people are reporting that there are all options on the table. The 2 prevailing options would be a 7-year deal and then a 3-year kind of, bridge deal. So, some of the projections for the 7-year deal versus the 3-year deal, the First of all, let's talk about this. $23 million in cap space right now for the Seattle Kraken. 7.2 AAV is what the estimation is if Maddie B does a 7-year deal. Now, also what Glenn writes is if we only do a bridge contract for a 3-year deal, sure, you're saving in the short term in theory, but you might pay more in the long term. And that's why the way Glenn phrases his article, it's like, which Matty Beniers, I'm using air quotes for those listening on audio, which Matty Beniers do you bet on? Do you bet on that he is going to score, 50 plus points? Or do we think maybe, at least for right now, he's kind of tapped out with what we saw last season? It's definitely an interesting question. So 7.2 million is what we're hearing for a 7 or 8 year deal, I should say. Some people saying 7, some people saying 8. A 3-year deal might be an AAV of 5 million. So another thing that I think is interesting is where does that put Maddie when it comes to comparable what am I trying to say? Comparable contracts. There we go. For the Seattle Kraken. Right now, we have, as far as forwards, the highest paid forward on the AAV scale, you've got Andrei Burakovsky at 5.5. You have also Jaden Schwartz at 5.5. So Burakovsky 5.5 through 27-28. You've got Jaden Schwartz at 5.5 through 26-27. That's when those two become UFAs. You have Bjorkstrand at 5.4 until 26-27. Yanni Gord at 5.1. McCann at 5 mil AAV up until 27-28, and that's with that extension. Eberle, who we just extended, 4.75 until 26-27. So, is Matty Beniers, is he more or I didn't mention Brandon Tanev, Ty Cartier also on an entry-level contract, but Brandon Tanev at 3.5. Do I think he's more valuable right now than Brandon Tanev? Yes. So we're going above 3.5. Andrei Burakovsky, again, taps out. Andrei Burakovsky and Jaden Schwartz tap out at 5.5. Where do we think Maddie B sits with those two? Berkey is the golden goose. We've talked about that a lot on this program. He's at 5.5. Is that where Maddie B belongs? Again, 8-year deal at AAV 7.2 million. There's no one on the forward bunch that's even close to that. Vince Dunn is at 7.35. And, he just got that extension, I guess, last offseason, coming into this past season. And then you have Philip Grubauer at 5.9. So where does Maddie B sit between Vince Dunn and Andrei Burakovsky? And do we want 7 million plus every year hold up in Maddie B versus maybe just 5 million with a 3-year deal? My gut is saying that Maddie B will be worth the 7.2, the longer deal. That's what my gut is saying. And even if he's not, I guess there are other moves that the Kraken need to make. And maybe, you kind of keep Maddie B, you develop him. I think a lot of this depends on how much you trust your staff to develop players. Is there more inherent trust in Dan Bylsma to develop a player like Matty Beniers than there was for Dave Haxtell? I would argue, and not only would I argue, but I'm really hoping that the answer is yes. Not because I had anything against Dave. I actually started to really appreciate what Dave brought to the table. And obviously, Bylsma has to do better. And I think he can. I'm also very curious who he brings in as an assistant. I think any one of his assistants at Coachella Valley makes a lot of sense. I just happen to have spoken to Jessica Campbell more so than Stu Bickle. Speaking of, you'll hear from Campbell in the next segment. So I'm leaning towards a longer deal. Is that 7.2 the right number? I think it values him just under Vince Dunn, at least for the contracts that are on the table now. Do I think that Matty Beniers is up there with value with Vince Dunn? Yes. Yes, I do. I do. He, relatively speaking, stays healthier than Andre Burakovsky. But then I guess the question for me is, are you willing and able to provide not just coaching support on your coaching staff, but also player support on the roster to ensure that the deal that we give Matty Beniers is a solid deal? There is an article that I have been touting around. I've talked to you about it before, by Mike Varell over at the Seattle Times. And I love the quote that he gives. I forget, it's from another sports personality, but effectively the quote is, "You're only as good as your roster." Now, this was in relation to Dan Bylsma, but I think that also goes for top players. I think that's why we've seen Andre Burakovsky struggle at times, not just because of his injuries, but when he's healthy. I talked about it. He's doing the most. What did we learn from Worlds? Andre Burakovsky didn't have to do, or it appeared as though he felt he had more support. Maybe his role was a little more defined with his national team, and he was playing free, not thinking so much. I think there's a lot of overthinking happening on this roster, especially for the top talent. So you're only as good as your roster. Even though that quote was used in an article for the Seattle Times to talk about Bylsma, I think it fits for Beniers as well. And we're going to talk about some other players and some other things that the Seattle Kraken have to not only do this offseason, but in my estimation, they really have to nail and do well this offseason. We're going to talk about that coming up on today's episode of Locked On Kraken. Today's episode of Locked On Kraken is brought to you by our friends at Policy Genius. Now, when you're looking for anything, you want to make sure that if it's not your wheelhouse, that you are saving time, saving money, and scouring for the best deals. Now, that can be very time consuming, obviously, but if you want peace of mind, because life can be unpredictable, then you need to head to Policy Genius. Policy Genius can help you find the right life insurance. They will scour everything for you. They will find everything that you need in the marketplace. It makes choosing your policy, the right policy for you and your family, quick and easy. So your work-life insurance policy may not offer the protections that you and your family need. Even worse, it may not come with you if you leave your job or if you lose your job. Policy Genius doesn't have any incentive to recommend one issuer over another. So that way you're getting the information that you need and not the information that perhaps an employer wants. You can trust their guidance. They have thousands of 5-star reviews on Google and Trustpilot from customers who found the best fit for their needs. So get peace of mind by finding the right life insurance policy with Policy Genius. Head to policygenius.com and click on the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you can save. Remember, that's policygenius.com to make sure that you get the best deal for you and your family. Thanks as always for making Locked On Kraken a part of your daily destination. And a reminder that you can check out Locked On Sports Today, which is our free 24/7 streaming channel. You can find it, of course, on Amazon Fire TV Channels app, as well as on YouTube. So make Locked On Podcast Network a part of your daily destination. Okay, lots that the Kraken have to do. And a part of that means just that they got to wait, at least when it comes to the coaching staff, because their new head coach is a little bit held up. That's right, Dan Bylsma. We talked about it a lot on yesterday's episode, but he and the Firebirds are waiting on their opponent, and they're going to have to wait a little bit longer. When we look at the series between Cleveland and Hershey, another overtime game between the two, Cleveland, the Monsters, were able to overcome Hershey in a 3-2 overtime game, which means that the two teams are slated for game 6. Hold on. Let me do the math real quick. They're slated for game 7, excuse me. Game 6 was yesterday, Monday. Game 7 is going to be Wednesday, and that will determine who we take on in the Calder Cup Finals. Now, if you're a longtime listener, everyday or OGer, you know that we took on the Hershey Bears, lost in 7. Heartbreaking loss in game 7. There's a part of me, and I think probably for at least some of the players, that would love to get another shot at Hershey. What we do know is that Disco Dan Bylsma, our new head coach for the Seattle Kraken, is calling his final days with the AHL team unfinished business. He is focused on the Firebirds. He is not focused on some of the to-do items that we're going to talk about in the next segment. And I love that. I love that for him. I love that for his players. And honestly, I love that for Seattle Kraken fans who maybe didn't tap into the Firebirds as much, who can now see what kind of coach we are getting. I think there's just a lot of excitement. People really, really tapped in, and I think it's going to be good. But that means there's a little bit of rest. Now, it's not as much time off as the Firebirds had when they got the first round bye. But I was able to speak to Jessica Campbell throughout this playoff run. This is some audio that didn't ever air fully on Locked On Kraken for a few different reasons. But I want to play it for you now, because part of the conversation that I had with Jessica was about how much time off is too much time off? And how do you bounce back when you are the more rested team, or if you are the unrested team, as either Cleveland or Hershey will be when they take on the Firebirds in the AHL Calder Cup Final? So here's my conversation with assistant coach for the Coachella Valley Firebirds, Jessica Campbell.
I think there's definitely challenges. You can look at it any way, but we're down for 12 days in terms of no game in that period, and so there's the adrenaline of being in playoffs, excited to play in playoffs, and so kind of I think taming that adrenaline and then channeling it into what do we need to do as a team to be prepared for when we do hit the ice, whether that's a week or 10 days or 2 weeks, doesn't really matter. I think for us as a group, as a staff, you think about the process of keeping your team sharp, game ready. That means the work is there, the practice pace has to be there, the intensity, but then also the scheduling and balancing all of that. So for us, we'd never been in this position before. Last year we didn't have the bye, and so we went into Calgary the same way, but on the other side of that, coming out of a 3-game series right till the very end, and going into their arena with the same, and them in the same position. And so I feel like we got through the weekend with what we wanted. We wanted to steal one off of them on the road and to bring it home into the second half for us to do what we want to do. But as for the process, we practiced. We tried to keep the pace no differently than what we would do to prepare for any other game. Our schedule was pretty consistent in that, but we also made sure that the rest and recovery was planned appropriately, and we also were able to scrimmage against each other. And you're never going to mock a game, but we brought that into the plans as well to try to keep that game intensity. And so I think we did what we could do. Obviously, you could look at it any which way, but I think we came out of the weekend with a split and ultimately happy with where we're at going into these next games at home.
But how much does maybe what happened last year kind of stay at the front of the minds of some of the players?
Yeah, I think last year's run was something special, in our inaugural season, and this, the formation of the Firebirds from start to finish. I think obviously it was a very bittersweet ending, and I don't think you have to talk much about that feeling. I think it's still very, very deep inside of us. There's still a burning fire to want to get that final win and that result that we wanted all at the end. And I think that's what's going to be a big part of, especially our veteran group, returning group, that are carrying that torch, and our younger players, like key players for us and prospects that are a big part of our team this year. And they were also part of that run. They might have not have been in the lineup last year, but they were here experiencing it all, and the emotion is embedded deep. And so I think if we can channel that and continue to channel that, the one thing I know about our group this year is we have a level of dig in and a factor within the locker room that is special, and I'm excited to see them really come together through this playoff run to leverage the experience from last year, to know the triumphs of what playoff hockey is. And you saw it last game. It was back and forth, goal for goal. We were fighting to the end, and it's going to go into overtime at times, and that's when big players need to step up. And I'm just excited that, we have great players and great competitors, and more so just great people in our locker room that we can rely on in moments and big moments to step up and to really lean into when it matters most to get those results that we need.
Yeah, indeed. And a lot of the conversation when you're talking with AHL coaches or even players is that you're a part of a larger ecosystem, of course, being the affiliate of the Seattle Kraken in the NHL. But when you get to this level of the AHL season, I'm going to ask it as simply as I can, but how much is it maybe an extra, or how does it work when, you don't have to necessarily focus too much on preparing athletes for the next level, or even thinking about, bringing players up from the ECHL, but, the rosters are locked, who your players are, and you can just kind of get after Firebirds hockey. I mean, how is that a little different than what it is in the regular season when you do have to worry about that revolving door a little bit more?
Yeah, I think our team really embraces the development process, and it's playoff hockey, but you still see it now. Guys are hopping on the ice early to work on their game, and they're staying on the ice later. And yeah, a lot of that revolves around feeling good and being at our best for playoffs, and that's paramount to everything and anything we do right now. And being smart with that. But I think that's what makes this group really special. And I know within our organization, we're excited about, and we've been able to see our young players come through that development cycle this year, and they start to reap the benefits of their game. And so really it's just honing in and tightening the process and the schedule day to day, that, like you said, the team and the lineup every night, they need to be at their best. They need, each player individually within the team and the whole needs to be feeling at their best and confident. So that's really where I think our focus goes to as coaches, is how do we make sure that Ryan Winterton is at his best, and how do we make sure that, Riker Evans joining us, he's been a part of our group this year, and obviously was part of Seattle, and to make sure that Riker is also at his best and bringing his experiences there and being a big part of this with this team. I think those are just examples of, where our focus goes as coaches, and that little subtle shift from in-season to playoff hockey. But the development and the process of getting better every single day never really changes within our locker room. And I think that's what makes us a very good team. I think that's what makes this organization special. And we've established that work-based identity here as a culture of ours. And so embracing it, bringing it every day, but also knowing that playoff hockey really matters, of what you do every day to be ready to perform when it counts.
I love those comments from Jessica Campbell saying, yeah, we only have to focus on the Firebirds this season, but it's never just about the Firebirds. And she listed off some names of players that their development matters, not just for the Firebirds, but for the Kraken as well. And that leads us to what we're going to close with this episode, what are some of the other things on the to-do list? I'm going to head over to our friends at Sound of Hockey, who I think have a pretty solid list. It pretty much matches what I've been saying on Locked on Kraken, including number 3 on their list, which I find really interesting. And it goes to what we just heard Jessica Campbell say. That's coming up on today's episode of Locked on Kraken. Mentioned it at the top of the show, but today's episode brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Now, you want to make every moment more, and FanDuel is going to help you to do that because new customers, you are going to get $200. That's right, sports fans, $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet as a new customer. So you're going to want to head over to fanduel.com/locked on to get started, set up your account, and your first winning bet of $5 or more will get you $200 in bonus bets that you can use on future bets, again, for the Seattle Storm, the Stanley Cup Finals, and much more. So again, make sure you visit fanduel.com/locked on to get started today. I want to thank you as always for making Locked on Kraken a part of your daily destination. We talked to Matty Beniers and what his contract extension negotiations are looking like. We heard from Jessica Campbell talking about how much rust or rest, if you will, plays into how you start a series. If you remember, we also had Jason JD Hernandez in one of our family reunion episodes talk a little bit about that as well, and did feel that the team was a little rusty in that game against Calgary, but they picked up the pace. You also heard from Jess Campbell that the resolve for this team is solid. And I think that is going to make a huge difference, especially as Campbell said, knowing that you're going to go into overtime every once in a while. And there was another thing, especially towards the end when we talked about development, that Jessica Campbell said that I thought was so interesting. And it goes to, again, what our friends over at the Sound of Hockey, especially or specifically Darren Brown, wrote about the offseason. Now, I've been telling you in the offseason, obviously coaching was huge. I think they announced the head coach sooner than I certainly thought they were in Dan Bylsma. But we also have to, of course, focus on the draft, the extension of Maddie Beniers. There's another player that I think we should extend as well. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But the player that I think we should extend, it actually goes into what is number 3 on Darren's list here, and finding more diamonds in the rough. And what do I mean by that? How does that relate to what we're talking about? Well, you just heard Jessica Campbell talk about Riker Evans and Ryan Winterton, and that their development and what's good for their development is good for the entire organization. Now, this is what Darren says, quote, "The Kraken hold the number 8 overall pick in the NHL draft, which will take place June 28th and 29th later this month in Las Vegas. While this draft is expected to have a steep drop off after the first few picks, there could be a stud defenseman available at 8 that would certainly help the organization. Hitting on that top pick is important, but so too is uncovering value deeper in the draft, something Seattle so far has excelled at in its first 3 seasons. Reinkoff, Molgard, Furcus, Neiman, Kokko, Goyette, Nelson, Evans, Winterton, Ovatanen, so many names of players that have a lot of promise. Now, we have an extra pick, as Darren says, acquired from the trade of Alex Wenberg to the Rangers, and an extra 3rd-round pick. So extra 2nd-round pick, extra 3rd-round pick this year. And what are we going to do with those picks? We've seen that the Seattle Kraken have parlayed picks into, and even prospects, I should say, into players that they then keep on the roster. So what are they going to do? And how will that fit into another contract that they should probably extend in Eeli Tolvanen? Now, Eeli Tolvanen, one of those diamonds in the rough, not through our development system, but through the waiver wire. Now, Darren is saying here, we suspect the Kraken will try to get extensions done with these players even before the deadline for qualifying offers. Tolvanen is due a significant raise after racking up 32 goals and 36 assists since Seattle claimed him from the Nashville Predators in the middle of the 22-23 season. He made $1.45 million this past season, and we would expect that annual average value, AAV, to at least double on his next deal. Now, we talked about Beniers, but I want you to hear what Darren has to say about Beniers, including that there are, quote, many factors at play. Didn't have a great sophomore season. He did win the Calder Trophy, but he surely would have wanted more to put himself in a position for a monster payday. And that quite honestly didn't happen. And that's why we have a little bit of the range that we do. The Kraken will likely use that as leverage to try and get Beniers under a long-term contract at a more reasonable cap hit. But if they won't go to a number that Beniers is willing to sign for 7 or 8 years, then that may lead to a shorter term bridge deal. In that case, Beniers would be betting on himself to take huge developmental steps in the next couple of seasons and really cash in on his next contract. Slippery slope with Beniers. So those are the things that stood out to me, especially regarding what we talked about on this episode, but other things that, I've talked about that we know the Seattle Kraken need, and of course that are on this list for Darren. Finding scoring. Duh. He wants 2 20-goal scorers, one at the center position, interesting, and one at the winger. And the center position makes a lot of sense. We don't have Wenberg, but I think we talked about Wenberg even before he was traded, right? We needed an upgrade there. And a 20-goal winger. He talks a little bit about Tomas Tatar, wouldn't be opposed to bringing him back, but as I've said, and as Darren kind of puts in here, we kind of saw the writing on the wall there. Round out the coaching staff. Hello. We've talked about that a bunch, including where Jessica Campbell could potentially fit into that, and add a depth defenseman. This, I want to read this quote. We think the more likely scenario, though, is that Justin Schultz is allowed to leave as a free agent, opening the door for Riker Evans to take on a more full-time role. How the team backfills for Schultz could be interesting because any upgrade could theoretically push Brian Dumoulin into a 7th defenseman role. Dumoulin was solid for his first year with the Kraken, though, so perhaps Seattle finds a way to fill the 7th spot from within. Interesting stuff from Darren. We're going to keep up with it here. Also, some interesting stuff in the notes and comments regarding Brandon Tanev, a name that I know we love, Turbo, and I think we have to have a real conversation about where Turbo fits long-term with the Kraken. We'll have time to talk about that hopefully in the offseason. Thanks as always for making Locked On Kraken a part of your daily destination and for sticking with me. It's really a bummer to have a cold during the summer months or when it's hotter outside, and that's what I'm dealing with a little bit. So if you hear a little bit of a foggy brain, just bear with me. I'm pushing through. Anyway, be kind to yourself. Be kind to one another. Hold fast. Stay true. Let's go Kraken, and let's get fired up. We'll find out on Wednesday night, who the Firebirds will take on in the championship series. I'm not sure it matters because, again, they've got some unfinished business, and we'll talk about it right here on the show. Until then, peace out, everybody.